Hey there, come closer to the fire and imagine an old temple breathing in the dark. The air is thick with incense. Clay tablets rest along the walls like sleeping messages. A priest has touched them with dusty hands. A scribe has pressed tiny wedge marks into wet clay, one after another, until the surface holds a memory older than most nations, older than most prayers, older than the certainty people later built around the word God. Tonight we are following a question that feels dangerous because it does not begin by attacking faith. It begins by touching history very gently. What if the God later worshipped by billions did not first appear in the ancient world as the only God above all things, but as a name moving through a crowded divine landscape, a storm voice from the desert, a presence among other powers, later lifted higher and higher until the older council around him disappeared into silence? If this quiet journey into ancient belief keeps you listening, leave a like and subscribe so the fire can stay lit for the next deep story. Now let the room soften a little. Let the candlelight become enough. We are not here to mock anyone who believes. We are here to listen to old texts, old stones, old names, and the uncomfortable spaces between them. Stand with me inside that temple again. The floor is cool beneath the feet. Incense smoke hangs in layers, blue and brown in the lamplight. Somewhere outside, the wind moves over mud brick walls. Inside, the clay tablets do not speak loudly. They never do. They wait. That is their power. A tablet can sit under dust for centuries and still keep a sentence that changes the room when it is read again. The first sentence of our story is not proof. It is possibility. Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God at the center of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, has a history inside human language. That may sound simple, but it is not simple at all. For many believers, Yahweh is eternal, outside time, beyond origin. But historians ask a different kind of question. Not whether God exists beyond history, but how the name Yahweh appears inside history, where the worship of Yahweh began, which people first spoke it, which mountains and deserts carried it, and how one regional divine name became the center of monotheism. The mainstream scholarly story begins carefully. Yahweh seems to emerge in the late Bronze Age, among Semitic peoples near the southern Levant, the regions of Edom, Midian, Seir, and the wilderness lands south and east of Canaan. Not first in the grand cities of Canaan, not first in the well-known god lists of Ugarit, not first among the old Canaanite family of El, Asherah, and Baal, at least not clearly. That absence matters. In the Ugaritic texts, the Canaanite divine world is full. El stands as the high god, old, wise, fatherly, presiding over a divine household. Asherah appears as a great mother figure. Baal thunders as the storm god, young, fierce, alive with rain, fertility, and battle. These texts name many divine beings, arranging them like a family under the high sky. But Yahweh is missing. A missing name can be louder than a present one. Imagine a scholar in a quiet archive, reading one tablet after another, expecting perhaps to find the name that later becomes so central, and finding only silence. El is there. Baal is there. Asherah is there. Other names appear like stars in a known sky. Yahweh does not. It is not enough to settle the whole question, but it pushes the search elsewhere, toward desert edges, nomadic groups, and older songs preserved inside the Hebrew Bible itself. The earliest outside references connect Yahweh with the Shasu, nomadic peoples known from Egyptian inscriptions. These references point toward lands such as Edom, Midian, and Seir. Dry places, border places, places of copper-colored stone, wind, goat paths, metalwork, camp smoke, and mountain storms. Some scholars argue that Yahweh may have begun as a southern deity, perhaps a god of storm, war, desert march, or even metallurgy. The Kenite or Midianite hypothesis suggests that Yahweh was worshipped by groups connected with metalworking, mining, and movement through the southern wilderness. That idea is debated. Of course, we cannot be sure, but it fits a few old hints. The oldest biblical poetry remembers Yahweh coming from the south, from Seir, from Edom, from the field of the desert. In the Song of Deborah, the earth trembles when Yahweh marches from Seir, and the heavens pour. That is not the calm image of a distant philosophical creator. That is a storm moving over wilderness, a God arriving with rain, shaking ground, and dangerous presence. The name comes through dust, through thunder, through the south. Picture that landscape. Not the green hill country of later Israel yet, but open desert. Stone ridges reddened by evening light, scrub clinging to dry ground. The smell of ash from a small fire. Men working copper, perhaps, their skin shining with heat, their tools ringing against ore. Women moving between tents or shelters. Animals restless in the wind. A mountain in the distance, hidden and revealed by storm cloud. A God worshipped there would not feel soft. He would feel like weather with a will. A presence that travels. A force that chooses a people on the move. This is where the story begins to become uneasy, because the later biblical tradition presents Yahweh as the only God, creator of heaven and earth. Yet the oldest historical traces suggest a more local entrance, a divine name tied to a particular region, a particular people, a particular storm-soaked memory from the margins. That does not automatically destroy faith, but it changes the texture of the story. Faith often wants a clear sky. History gives us a sky full of old clouds. As Israel emerged in the hill country of Canaan, around the end of the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age, its religion appears to have been part of a wider ancient Near Eastern world. The people who became Israelites were not sealed away from Canaanite culture. They shared language, material culture, farming life, village patterns, and likely many religious assumptions. Their God did not enter a blank world. He entered a crowded one. Over time, Yahweh and El began to merge. That is the next quiet transformation. El, the Canaanite high God, already had the status Yahweh would later carry. He was Father of gods, Alcio, wise, enthroned, creator-like in some traditions, ruler over divine assembly. Yahweh, arriving with storm, war, desert, and covenant force, gradually absorbed El's titles and authority. The two figures blended until later readers could hardly see the seam. By the time later biblical texts speak, the merger is so complete that Yahweh can be called El, Elohim, El Shaddai, El Elyon, the Most High, Lord, God of gods, Lord of hosts. The names layer over each other like old paint on temple stone. But under the paint, older shapes remain. One of the most revealing is Deuteronomy 32. In its older forms, preserved in ancient manuscript traditions, the Most High divides the nations according to the number of the sons of God, and Yahweh receives Jacob, Israel, as his portion. Let that sit for a moment. The text does not sound like later philosophical monotheism. It sounds like a divine council dividing territories, with Yahweh receiving one people among others. Some theologians explain this through angels, others through later interpretation. Some scholars argue it reflects an older polytheistic or henotheistic layer, where many gods were acknowledged, but Israel owed exclusive loyalty to Yahweh. That is called monolatry, the worship of one God without denying that others exist. That may be why the first commandment sounds the way it does. You shall have no other gods before me. It does not begin as an abstract lesson in metaphysics. It sounds like a covenant of exclusive loyalty. Not those gods. This God. Not their altars. This altar. Not their names. This name. The God who later becomes universal begins, in the older voice of the text, as the God who claims a people. The temple air grows colder when we notice that, because it means the Bible itself preserves traces of the world it later tries to overcome. Psalm 82 carries the same feeling. God stands in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he judges. The scene is stark. One divine figure condemns the others for injustice. He tells them they are gods, sons of the Most High, but they will die like men and fall like princes. That passage has troubled interpreters for centuries. Are these goods angels? Are they human judges? Are they real divine beings remembered from an older worldview? The text does not pause to explain itself. It assumes a council. It assumes multiple divine figures. It assumes judgment among them. Later theology has to work hard around it, because the old words are not tidy. Honestly, I have always found these fragments more haunting than any dramatic conspiracy. They are small enough to survive. They sit inside the scripture like old bones under a polished floor. You can walk over them for years, and then one day the floor creaks. The exile matters. When Babylon destroys Jerusalem, the old question becomes unbearable. If Yahweh is the God of Israel, and Israel falls, has Yahweh lost? Is Marduk stronger? Have the gods of Babylon defeated the God of Jerusalem? The prophetic answer is brilliant and devastating. No, Yahweh did not lose. Yahweh used Babylon. The defeat was punishment, not failure. Yahweh is not one national god among others. Yahweh rules all nations. And if Yahweh rules all nations, then the other gods must shrink. They become idols, demons, angels, nothing, lice, powerless images. The council fades. The many become shadows. The one remains. That is how monotheism hardens. Not in one moment. Through memory, reform, war, exile, theology, and editing. This is the darker history behind certainty. A faith that later speaks as if it always stood alone may have passed through a crowded room before the other voices were silenced. The candle beside us flickers. The temple walls hold their clay tablets. Outside the temple, desert wind still moves somewhere in the old memory of Yahweh, carrying dust from Seir and Edom. Inside the archive, the old council texts still wait. A name is missing from one god list. A name appears in a desert inscription. A poem remembers a storm from the south. A psalm shows God judging other gods. A scroll says Yahweh once received a portion. No single clue proves the whole story, but together they make the floor uneven. And as we descend deeper, the path will lead not only through Israel and Canaan, but farther east, toward Sumer, toward the Anunnaki, toward Enlil and Enki, toward the old flood stories, and toward the uncomfortable question that refuses to sleep. Was Yahweh born entirely apart from those ancient gods, or did his story rise from the same deep clay? The old counsel in the Hebrew text does not stand alone. To understand why it feels so strange, we have to go east, back to the river plain of Sumer, where the clay is dark after floodwater, where reeds move along the canals, and where the gods were not vague ideas floating beyond the world. They had names, houses, cities, servants, families, rivalries, tempers, and long memories. They could bless a king. They could ruin a city. They could receive bread and beer in a temple, as if the offering were not symbol, but food. This is the world of the Anunnaki. The name itself has been pulled into many dramatic claims, so we should hold it carefully. In the Sumerian and Akkadian world, the Anunnaki are the great gods, the princely offspring, the high divine powers connected with Anu, the heaven god. Some alternative writers have claimed the word means those who from heaven came, but mainstream scholars do not accept that translation. The name is older, more royal, more embedded in the divine family of Mesopotamia. And still, even without the more sensational translation, the Anunnaki are mysterious enough. They rule like a council. Anu stands high and distant. The sky, authority, the old source of divine kingship. Enlil stands closer to the world. Wind, storm, command, earth, fate, and royal power gathered around him like pressure before rain. Enki, also called Ea in Akkadian tradition, dwells in the Apsu, the deep fresh water beneath the earth, wise, cunning, merciful when it suits him, dangerous when wisdom becomes a blade. Ninhursag is the mother power, tied to birth, bodies, and the shaping of life. Inanna, later called Ishtar, burns with love, war, desire, sovereignty, and the terrible brightness of a goddess who refuses to stay in one role. Mainstream Assyriology reads them as divine figures of an ancient religion, mythic expressions of nature, society, ritual, kingship, and cosmic order. That is a careful view, and it deserves respect. The Sumerians and Babylonians were not writing modern history in the way we would write a record of a king or a battle. They were telling sacred stories about the structure of reality. But here is the reason people keep feeling the floor shift beneath these texts. The gods behave concretely. Their temples are houses. Their statues are washed and dressed. Their meals are prepared. Their city territories are managed. Their offerings are counted on tablets. Their words authorize kings. Their anger can become plague, famine, storm, or flood. They are mythic, yes, but they are mythic in a world where religion, politics, economy, and daily labor all move through the temple. If you were standing here with me in ancient Nippur, you would not feel that Enlil was an abstract symbol. You would see his temple, the Eker, the mountain house, mud brick rising in the heat, courtyards filled with movement, priests carrying offerings, scribes pressing records into clay, kings arriving to seek legitimacy, workers bringing grain, oil, wool, animals, and labor into a sacred economy built around the presence of a god. Now, listen again to the Hebrew Divine Council. God stands among gods. The Most High divides nations among sons of God. Yahweh receives Israel as his portion. Other divine beings appear around the throne in Job and Kings and Psalms. The structure feels less strange when placed beside Mesopotamia. A high divine council, a presiding deity, assigned territories, divine beings linked with nations, kingship and fate descending from heaven. This does not prove Yahweh was one of the Anunnaki. It does show why the comparison exists. The shapes resemble one another. This is where Zecharia Sitchin enters the modern story. In 1976, he published The 12th Planet, a book that turned the Anunnaki from ancient gods into beings from another world. According to his theory, the Anunnaki came from a planet called Nibiru, which followed a vast orbit through the solar system. They came to Earth for gold. They established mining operations. They created humans by mixing their own essence with earlier hominids, shaping us as a worker species to serve them. But scholars rejected it strongly. Sitchin did not have formal training in Sumerian or Akkadian. His translations are not accepted by specialists. The word Anunnaki does not mean those who came from heaven. Nibiru in Babylonian astronomical texts is not clearly a 12th planet on a 3,600-year orbit. There are no accepted Sumerian tablets describing gold mining Anunnaki astronauts creating humans through modern-style genetic engineering. We need to say that plainly. The alien version is not supported by the evidence as scholars understand it. But rejecting Sitchin does not erase the harder question underneath. What is the relationship between the Mesopotamian gods and the God of the Bible? That question remains even after Nibiru fades. Because Genesis does not rise from nowhere, the biblical authors lived in a world shaped by older Near Eastern stories. During and after the Babylonian exile, Israelite scribes encountered Mesopotamian myths, law codes, cosmology, royal ideology, and temple culture at a depth that would leave marks. Some traditions were older than the exile, carried through oral memory and regional exchange. But Babylon made the comparison unavoidable. The creation account in Genesis stands beside Mesopotamian creation traditions, including the Enuma Elish. There, the god Marduk defeats the chaos sea goddess Tiamat and forms the world. In Genesis, God divides the waters above and below, and the deep carries a word related to that older chaos sea. The biblical account is calmer, more ordered, more theologically refined, but the old water is still there, dark beneath the text. Then comes the flood. This is the strongest mirror. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods become disturbed by humanity. Enlil is angered by human noise and multiplication. He sends disasters. Then he supports the flood that will destroy humanity. Enki, wiser and more sympathetic, warns Atrahasis through a clever loophole. The man builds a boat. The vessel is sealed with pitch. Life is preserved. After the waters recede, Atrahasis offers sacrifice, and the gods gather around the sweet smoke because they have missed the offerings. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim tells a similar flood story. Again, a chosen survivor, a great boat, pitch, preserved life, birds sent out, sacrifice after land returns. In Genesis, Noah is warned by Yahweh. He builds the ark. He seals it with pitch. He brings animals. The flood comes. Birds are sent. Land returns. Noah sacrifices. Yahweh smells the pleasing aroma and promises not to destroy all life by flood again. The sequence is too close to ignore. The difference is theological. In Mesopotamia, the destructive decision and the saving mercy belong to different divine figures, Enlil and Enki. In Genesis, both are inside Yahweh. Yahweh judges. Yahweh saves. Yahweh sends the flood. Yahweh preserves Noah. Yahweh receives the sacrifice. Yahweh promises restraint. The alternative theory sees this as a merger. The older polytheistic story has been monotheized. Enlil the destroyer and Enki the savior are folded into one god. The story remains, but the council disappears. Mainstream scholars would usually say this is literary adaptation, not proof that Yahweh is Enlil. The biblical writers used older flood traditions and reshaped them to express a different theology. That is a serious explanation. But even this serious explanation admits the deeper fact. The Bible is in conversation with Mesopotamia. And once you see that conversation, the silence between the lines becomes louder. That is why the Yahweh and Enlil comparison refuses to vanish. Enlil is Lord of storm, wind, command, and kingship. Yahweh, in some of the oldest biblical poems, comes as a storm god. The earth trembles. The heavens pour. Sinai shakes with thunder, cloud, smoke, and fire. Yahweh appears in pillar of cloud and pillar of fire. He rides on the wings of the wind in the Psalms. He commands, judges, punishes, chooses kings, gives law, and demands precise ritual loyalty. The likeness is real, but likeness is not identity. Storm gods were common in the ancient Near East. Baal was a storm god. Hadad was a storm god. Teshub was a storm god. Many cultures imagine divine power in thunder, because thunder makes even kings look up. Yahweh may share storm imagery because he belongs to that wider religious atmosphere, not because he is directly Enlil under another name. Also, Enlil's main cult center was Nippur. Yahweh's early geography points south of Canaan and later toward Sinai, Israel, and Jerusalem. If the two were simply the same, we might expect clearer lines. We do not have them. No Sumerian tablet says Enlil went west and became Yahweh. No accepted god list names Yahweh as Anunnaki. No clean bridge exists. What we have is structure, resemblance, borrowing, memory, transformation, and a deep old habit of gods absorbing one another. That is enough for mystery, not enough for certainty. The fire beside us burns lower now. In the half-light, Sumer and Israel seem far apart, then strangely close. Nippur and Jerusalem, Enlil and Yahweh, Enki and Noah's saving instruction, the divine council and the sons of God, clay tablet and Hebrew scroll, separate worlds, but not sealed worlds. Religion in the ancient Near East moved like water through canals. It crossed borders. It changed names. It carried silt from one land into another. A god could begin as one thing and become another. A story could pass from city to city and be washed clean, then written again. A council of many could become the court of one. A regional deity could become universal. A storm voice from the desert could rise until every other voice was called false. So we do not end this part with a verdict. We end with a doorway. Behind us, Yahweh has emerged from desert, council, and old Israelite plurality. Before us, the Anunnaki stand in Sumerian shadow, not as proven alien, but as the ancient divine administrators whose stories echo strangely through later scripture. The question remains warm in the ashes, not whether faith must die when history speaks, but whether faith is brave enough to remember where its names have been. Sumer begins with mud that remembers water. Before towers became ruins, before tablets slept in museums, before the Bible was copied in candlelit rooms, there was the low river plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates. The land was flat enough to make the sky feel enormous. Reeds grew thick along canals. Fish moved through brown-green water. Bricks dried in rows under the sun. Everything important seemed to come from clay. Houses, bowls, walls, tablets, and the bodies of cities themselves. If Yahweh enters history through desert wind, the Anunnaki enter through river mud. The first cities rose here with a confidence that still feels unsettling. Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, Lagash, Kish. Names like stones in the mouth. These were not small camps gathered around fire. These were urban worlds, with temples, storehouses, scribes, workers, priests, kings, fields, canals, and gods who were not merely imagined far away. They were housed. A god had a city. A god had a temple. A god had meals. That is the part modern people often miss. In Sumer, the temple was not just a place where humans thought about gods. It was the house of a god, a living center of divine presence, social power, and economic order. People brought bread, beer, wool, grain, animals, oil, work, songs. The statue of the god was washed, dressed, fed, praised, and carried in procession. To serve the temple was not a side activity. It was the shape of civilization. Now stand with me at dawn in Nippur. The air is dry, but the canals breathe dampness into the city. Dust rests on mud brick walls. A priest crosses a courtyard before the heat begins to rise. He carries something ordinary and sacred at once, bread for the house of Enlil. The bread is warm, and the steam fades quickly in the morning air. Nearby, a scribe sits with a tablet on his lap, pressing signs into clay to record what was given, what was owed, what was received. The god is unseen, but the system moves because of him. Enlil is not a soft figure. He is command, wind, authority, decree, kingship, the power that gives order and can also withdraw it. In the old Mesopotamian imagination, Enlil is one of the highest powers, the one whose word can fix destiny, whose favor can make a king legitimate, whose anger can leave a city exposed. His temple, the Eker, is called the Mountain House, though it stands in the flatness of Mesopotamia. That name matters. Mountains reach upward. Temples imitate mountains. The god descends into architecture, and humans climb toward him with offerings. Above Enlil in the divine family is Anu, the Sky Father, high and distant, a power more remote, less involved in the daily mud of the world. Beneath and beside the great powers stands Enki, Lord of the Apsu, the deep fresh water beneath the earth, clever, patient, slippery with wisdom. Enki is the one who often helps humans when the other gods choose severity. He is not harmless. Wisdom never is. But he is the god who finds a side path when the main road ends in destruction. Ninhursag stands with birth, the mountain mother, the shaping of bodies, the deep seriousness of life entering flesh. Inanna, later known as Ishtar, burns through the divine world with love, war, desire, queenship, beauty, rage, and motion. She is never one thing for long, which is probably why she still feels alive when read after so many centuries. These gods are not tidy. They quarrel, desire, command, deceive, protect, destroy, regret, feast, travel, build cities, choose kings, send disasters, accept offerings. Their stories are large because they explain a world in which natural force, political power, fertility, war, and daily labor were never separated. That is why the Anunnaki matter to our question. They show a divine council world before the Bible becomes the Bible. The Anunnaki, in mainstream understanding, are not proven beings from another planet. They are the great gods of Mesopotamian religion, royal, cosmic, frightening, intimate, and deeply tied to the administration of life. The word has been pulled into wild modern theories, but the older truth is already strange enough. Ancient Sumerians and Akkadians imagined a universe governed by divine powers who held assemblies, decreed destinies, assigned kingship, punished cities, and received service through temples. If that sounds familiar after listening to the Hebrew Divine Council passages, it should. The resemblance is structural, not identical, not simple, but real. A high God, a council of divine beings, nations or cities under heavenly powers, kingship descending from above, divine decrees shaping earthly order, ritual service feeding the bond between humans and gods. A universe where politics on earth reflects politics in heaven. The Hebrew Bible did not form in isolation from such a world. It grew near it, against it, inside it, and sometimes by transforming it. Imagine a clay archive in a temple storehouse. Rows of tablets, some smooth, some cracked, some still damp when first stored, some baked hard by fire in later destruction. They hold lists of offerings, hymns to gods, myths of creation, legal matters, field accounts, and god names. One tablet tells who received barley. Another tells a story of gods making humans to bear labor. Another remembers a flood. Another praises a king because heaven has chosen him. A later Israelite scribe may never touch those exact tablets, but the world behind them breathes through the whole region. Stories travel. Merchants carry more than goods. Captives carry songs. Priests carry formulas. Kings borrow language. Scribes learn from older scribes. Empires move people like dust in wind. A flood story can cross borders. A divine council image can be reshaped. A high god can absorb titles from another high god. A storm god can become the voice of a people, then the ruler of all. Religion moves like water through irrigation channels. It is guided, blocked, redirected, but it seeps. This is why the Anunnaki question is not only about aliens or sensational claims. It is about inheritance. It asks whether later biblical theology carries within it transformed pieces of older Mesopotamian theology, not copied in a simple childish way, transformed, disputed, purified, rewritten, but still connected. Consider kingship. In Mesopotamia, kingship descends from heaven. The city king rules because the gods allow it. In the Bible, kings are chosen by Yahweh. Saul is chosen, then rejected. David is chosen, then promised a dynasty. Solomon builds the temple. Kings rise and fall under divine favor and judgment. The theology is different, but the structure of divine authorization is familiar. Consider temples. In Sumer, the god dwells in the temple. The temple is the divine house. In Jerusalem, Yahweh chooses a place for his name to dwell. The temple is not simply symbolic. It becomes the earthly center of divine presence, sacrifice, priesthood, song, purity, and royal theology. Again, not identical, but the ancient Near Eastern logic is shared. A god may be beyond heaven, yet located in ritual space. Consider sacrifice. Mesopotamian gods receive meals. Biblical sacrifice is later interpreted in many ways: obedience, atonement, covenant, thanksgiving, purity. Yet the language of pleasing aroma after the flood still feels old. Smoke rises. The divine receives it. The relationship is repaired. The old world is not erased. It is argued with. Honestly, this is where the story becomes more interesting than any simple claim that one God is secretly another. Ancient religion is not a row of sealed boxes. It is a storm system. Clouds merge. Winds cross. Names change. Attributes move. Cities fall, and their gods are reinterpreted by the victors. Exiles ask why their god allowed defeat, and sometimes the answer makes the god larger than before. The Anunnaki are the great background of divine administration. Yahweh enters that background from the south, then rises through Israelite memory, absorbs El's high god status, defeats or displaces Baal in prophetic imagination, stands in or above the divine council, and eventually becomes the only true God in strict monotheism. That is a long journey. A desert name becomes cosmic. A regional storm presence becomes universal creator. A god among old divine language becomes the one before whom all other gods are nothing. The Sumerian divine world helps us see how dramatic that journey is. Back in Nippur, Enlil's temple stands in morning heat. In Eridu, Enki's waters breathe beneath the earth. In Uruk, Inanna receives songs and offerings. In Ur, the moon god Nana watches the night. Every city has a divine center. Every divine center has ritual. Every ritual has humans making the invisible visible through action. Bread placed before a statue. Beer poured into a vessel. A king kneeling. A scribe recording. A priest washing the divine image. A worker carrying clay bricks up a temple platform. The gods rule through these repeated gestures. Later, Israel will also know repeated gestures. Sacrifice. Song. Priesthood. Ark. Temple. Law. Covenant. Festival. Kingship. Prophecy. He-form. Exile. Return. The forms differ, but the ancient grammar of divine order remains. This is the bridge to the next and more dangerous phase of the story. Because once people noticed that the Anunnaki were so concrete, so administrative, so involved in creating humans, ruling cities, granting kingship, and sending floods, some modern writers began to ask whether the myths were not myths at all, but distorted memories of literal beings. That road leads to Zachariah Sitchin, to Nibiru, to gold mines, to engineered humans, to a theory most scholars reject, and yet to a popular fascination that refuses to die. For now, stay with the older, Kvita strangeness. Before the alien books, before television speculation, before internet diagrams and secret planet claims, there were tablets, there were cities, there were gods who ate, judged, commanded, loved, fought, and ruled from houses of mud brick and sacred fear. And somewhere far to the west, in desert wind and mountain storm, the name Yahweh was beginning its own ascent through the crowded sky of ancient gods. The old question is not whether ancient people were foolish enough to confuse stone houses with heaven. They were not foolish. They knew mud brick was mud brick. They also knew that a ritual house could hold a presence, a name, a fear, and a political order larger than the walls themselves. That is why these temples matter. They show us a world where the boundary between administration and worship was thin as smoke. And when we later find biblical language of heavenly courts, divine armies, chosen kings, sacred mountains, and a God whose voice rides storm and fire, the Mesopotamian background does not answer every question. It simply makes the shadows deeper. The modern version of the Anunnaki mystery begins, strangely enough, not in a temple, but on a bookshelf. A person opens an old paperback at night. The room is dim. The cover promises lost planets, secret origins, ancien astronaut, and the possibility that the gods of Sumer were never gods at all. Outside, the ordinary world continues. Cars passing, pipes humming, clocks moving. But inside the book, the clay tablets seem to turn into launch records, mining reports, and genetic laboratories under the stars. This is the world Zachariah Sitchin gave to the modern imagination. In 1976, he published The 12th Planet. The book became one of the great engines of ancient astronaut belief. According to Sitchin, the Anunnaki were not mythological gods, and not symbolic powers of nature, society, or ritual. They were extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, a world he claimed followed a long orbit through the solar system. They came to Earth seeking gold. They established mining operations. They created humans as a worker species, shaping them through a kind of genetic intervention so the Anunnaki would no longer need to perform the heavy labor themselves. It is a dramatic story. Perhaps too dramatic. Enki becomes the scientist, the genetic engineer, the clever helper who participates in human creation and later protects humanity. Enlil becomes the strict commander, authoritarian, angry, willing to reduce or destroy humans when they become too numerous or too loud. The flood becomes not merely mythic judgment. but a historical catastrophe tied to Anunnaki politics. Noah, or Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim, becomes the survivor protected by one faction against another. You can feel why people were drawn to it. It takes the old stories and makes them concrete in a modern way. Clay and divine blood become genetics. Heaven becomes outer space. Gods become visitors. Temples become bases. Human labor becomes a mining project. The divine council becomes a command structure. Suddenly, myths that once floated in symbolic darkness seem to have machinery under them. And yet, this is where we must slow down. Scholars of Sumerian and Akkadian do not accept Sitchin's translations. They do not accept his reading of Nibiru as a hidden planet on a 3,600-year orbit. They do not accept that the word Anunnaki means those who came from heaven to earth. They do not accept that the tablets describe alien gold miners genetically engineering Homo sapiens. His work is widely rejected by specialists because he often reads texts against their grammar, context, and known meanings. That needs to be said plainly. A good mystery does not need bad translation to survive. The Sumerian texts are already strange. They already describe gods creating humans to work, divine councils deciding human fate, flood stories older than Genesis, gods living in temples, kingship descending from heaven, and a world where political authority is mirrored in the sky. We do not need to force a spaceship into the temple courtyard to feel the ground tremble. Honestly, I think that is the trap with sensational theories. They sometimes make the mystery smaller by pretending to solve it too neatly. An alien engineer with a plan is easier to understand than the slow, messy transformation of religion across cultures, centuries, vars, exile, and languages. But the slower mystery may be the deeper one. So let us separate two things. First, the unsupported claim that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials from Nibiru who mined gold and engineered humans. That claim is not accepted by mainstream scholarship. Second, the serious question whether biblical stories, including the portrayal of Yahweh, were shaped by older Mesopotamian myths and divine structures. That question is real. Scholars debate it, refine it, argue over details, and sometimes disagree sharply. But it belongs inside the study of ancient history. The trouble is that the two questions often get tangled. People hear that Genesis shares flood motifs with Atrahasis and Gilgamesh, and they leap to ancient astronauts. But a shared literary world is not the same as a secret alien record. People hear that humans are made from clay and divine substance, and they leap to genetic engineering. But ancient creation language can be theological, ritual, symbolic, and social without being laboratory notes. The old tablets deserve better than being turned into quick proof for whatever we already want to believe. Now imagine two tables in a quiet room. On one table, clay tablets from Mesopotamia, broken edges, wedge signs, names like Enlil, Enki, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim. Stories of gods deciding, humans surviving, floods rising, smoke pleasing, hungry divine beings. On the other table, a Hebrew scroll. Genesis. Noah. Yahweh. The deep waters. The ark sealed with pitch. Birds sent over the flood. Sacrifice after land returns. A promise that the waters will not erase all life again. The two tables are close. Not identical. Close. That is where the serious mystery lives. Genesis did not emerge in an empty room. The Israelites lived among, fought against, traded with, learned from, and were conquered by peoples whose stories were older and wider than their own. The Babylonian exile made that contact especially intense. Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was lost. Elites were taken to Babylon, a city saturated with Mesopotamian mythology, scholarship, astronomy, ritual, law, and imperial theology. Imagine an exiled scribe by the rivers of Babylon. He hears foreign hymns, sees great temples, learns the language of empire, hears stories of creation and flood that are older than his own people. Perhaps he resists them. Perhaps he studies them. Perhaps he recognizes echoes. Perhaps he rewrites his own tradition with sharper edges because exile forces every belief to answer the question of defeat. If Babylon has conquered Jerusalem, has Marduk defeated Yahweh? The biblical answer becomes no. Yahweh is not defeated. Yahweh rules even Babylon. The empire is an instrument of judgment, not proof of divine weakness. That theological move is enormous. It turns a national god into a universal sovereign. It absorbs the language of empire and redirects it. It takes the crisis of defeat and makes Yahweh larger than the defeat. This is the kind of transformation that can make an older storm god into the god of all history. The flood stories show the transformation clearly. In Adrahasis, Enlil is disturbed by humanity and supports the flood. Enki, bound by the council, finds a loophole and warns Atrahasis through a reed wall. The man builds a boat. The flood comes. The gods regret the scale of destruction. Afterward, the survivor offers sacrifice, and the gods gather around the sweet smell like flies. In Genesis, there is no Enki beside Yahweh. There is no separate Enlil above him. Yahweh decides the flood. Yahweh van Noah. Yahweh gives instructions. Yahweh preserves life. Yahweh smells the pleasing aroma. Yahweh promises restraint. The polytheistic drama is compressed into one divine will. That does not prove Yahweh is Enlil. It suggests that the biblical authors took an older kind of story and made it monotheistic. All divine functions move into one God. Judgment and mercy. Storm and covenant. Destruction and preservation. Anger and promise. This is more subtle than saying Yahweh was secretly an Anunnaki god. It is also more historically grounded. The biblical God may be shaped by a world in which Enlil like command, Enki like mercy, El like high fatherhood, Baal like storm power, and other divine traditions were known, contested, and reworked. A god can grow by absorbing language. A tradition can purify itself while carrying the very traces it claims to leave behind. The Sitchin story tried to make this concrete with planets and gold. The scholarly story makes it concrete with texts, history, exile, scribes, rituals, and borrowings. It has fewer explosions. It has more dust. But dust is often where the truth waits. Still, the popular imagination does not let go easily. There is a reason ancient astronaut theories keep returning. Modern people look at ancient monuments, read stories of gods descending from heaven, hear of beings creating humans, and feel that ordinary explanations are too small. Part of that feeling comes from ignorance. We often underestimate ancient human brilliance, but part of it comes from the genuine strangeness of the records. The old texts do not sound modern. They resist us. They speak in images that hover between theology, memory, ritual, and myth. A god comes down. A council meets. Humans are made for labor. A flood is sent. One god saves what another would destroy. Kingship descends from heaven. The boundary between myth and history does not behave like a clean wall. It behaves like smoke. That smoke fills the next chamber of the story, because once Sitchin's alien claims are set aside, one question remains in the dark, more modest and more dangerous. If the biblical writers inherited flood stories, divine council imagery, storm god language, sacred kingship, temple theology, and high god titles from the older Near Eastern world, then how much of Yahweh's later portrait is original revelation, and how much is transformation of earlier divine patterns? This is where faith and history begin to sit very close together. Not enemies, not friends exactly. More like two old witnesses facing the same fire, each remembering the night differently. The fire beside us lowers now. The old paperback closes. The clay tablets remain open in imagination. The scholar turns back to grammar, sign lists, broken lines, and cautious translation. The believer turns back to Scripture. The storyteller keeps both lamps burning, because the shadows between them are where the oldest questions move. Sitchin may have been wrong about Nibiru, but he pointed, perhaps accidentally, toward a real unease. The gods of Mesopotamia did not vanish when their temples fell. Their stories survived in pieces, in floodwaters, divine councils, templar rituals, kingship from heaven, and the language later used to speak of one God. The question is not whether the Anunnaki came from a hidden planet. The question is whether some part of their old divine world still echoes inside the name Yahweh. That echo is not a verdict. It is a sound in a ruined room. It might be influence. It might be shared inheritance. It might be polemic, where later writers deliberately reshape older myths to say their god is not like the other gods. Sometimes a tradition borrows because it admires. Sometimes it borrows because it fights. Sometimes it borrows because everyone in the room already knows the story, and the only question is how to tell it differently. So we leave the modern speculation where it belongs. Outside the temple door. Interesting, seductive, but unproven. Then we step back inside, where the older evidence waits more patiently. Clay, smoke, floodwater. Exile. A scribe listening to Babylon and answering with Genesis. A God who judges like Enlil and saves like Enki, yet speaks in one voice. Genesis does not float alone above the older waters. It stands beside them, listening. When we place the flood story of Noah near the older stories of Atrahasis and Utnapishtim, the room grows very quiet. Not because the stories are identical. They are not. Each has its own theology, tone, structure, and purpose. But the shared bones are too close to ignore. A divine decision. A coming flood. A chosen man. A boat. Pitch. Preserved life. Birds. Land returning. Sacrifice. Smoke rising into the sky after the waters fall. The old world keeps repeating the same dark shape. Water above human pride. A warning before silence. A vessel in the storm. A survivor stepping into mud. In the Mesopotamian version, the divine world is divided. Enlil is disturbed by humanity. Humans have grown too many, too noisy, too troublesome. The land bellows with them. The great God of command wants quiet. He first sends plague, then drought, then famine, and when these measures fail, he supports the flood. Enki, the god of deep water and wisdom, sees the cruelty of total destruction and finds a loophole. He warns Atrahasis indirectly, speaking to the reed wall of his house. Reed wall, listen. That line is strange enough to feel alive after thousands of years. A god cannot speak directly to the man, so he speaks to the wall, and the man hears what the wall has heard. It is legal trickery. It is mercy disguised as architecture. It is the divine world arguing with itself through woven reeds. Then the instructions come. Tear down the house. Build a boat. Seal it with pitch. Preserve life. Now place Genesis beside it. Noah receives warning from Yahweh. He builds the ark. It is sealed with pitch. Animals are brought in. Waters rise. The world disappears beneath rain and deep fountains. Birds are sent to search for land. After the flood, Noah offers sacrifice. Yahweh smells the pleasing aroma and promises not to destroy all living creatures in the same way again. The old Mesopotamian story gives judgment to one God and mercy to another. Genesis gives both to Yahweh. That is the important difference. Not the boat. Not the birds. Not the pitch. Those matter, yes. But the deepest change is theological. In Genesis, there is no separate Enlil above, no Enki below, no divine assembly quarreling in full view. The argument has been moved inside one God. Yahweh judges. Yahweh warns. Yahweh destroys. Yahweh preserves. Yahweh receives the smoke. Yahweh restrains himself afterward. The many voices have become one voice. Some scholars describe this as the monotheizing of older traditions. A story once told in a world of divine conflict is reshaped for a world in which one God contains all divine functions. The flood remains, but the council fades. The drama becomes more internal, more solemn, more morally concentrated. If you were a scribe in exile, sitting by a foreign river in Babylon, that transformation would matter. Imagine him in the evening. The river is dark. The city is enormous. Babylon smells of baked brick, bitumen, incense, smoke, animal breath, and empire. Foreign gods have temples here. Foreign priests sing hymns older than Jerusalem's temple. The defeated Judean scribe has heard the stories. He knows that Babylon has its own flood, its own creation, its own divine order, its own claim that kings and cities rise under heavenly power. He is not writing in a vacuum. He is answering. That may be the quiet power of Genesis. It does not simply copy the older flood. It takes a story known across the ancient Near East and says, "No, this belongs to Yahweh." The waters answer to him. The judgment is his. The mercy is his. The survivor lives because he speaks. The covenant after the flood comes from him alone. This is not a small edit. It is a conquest of story. A flood tradition moves from the council of many gods into the authority of one. And yet, the older shape still presses through. The pleasing aroma after Noah's sacrifice feels especially old. In the Mesopotamian flood, the gods gather around the offering like flies, because they have been starved of human service. It is almost embarrassing in its honesty. The gods needed humans. Without offerings, without temple smoke, without bread and beer, the divine economy failed. The flood silenced the noise, but also silenced the kitchen. Genesis makes the scene more dignified. Yahweh smells the pleasing aroma and speaks a promise. The hungry crowd of gods is gone, but the smoke remains. The offering remains. The idea that sacrifice repairs the relationship between human earth and divine sky remains. Smoke is one of the oldest bridges. It rises because heat makes it rise. But human beings rarely let such things remain simple. Smoke leaves the animal, the grain, the fat, the wood, the hand, the altar, the wet ground after flood, and it travels upward where no hand can follow. It is visible prayer. It is food becoming air. It is matter becoming message. No wonder both worlds kept it. Now consider the creation waters. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, creation begins in conflict among divine waters and powers. Tiamat, the salt sea, becomes a chaos figure defeated by Marduk, who forms the world from her body. In Genesis, the account is calmer, cleaner, almost liturgical. The deep is there. The waters are there. Darkness is over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moves over the waters. God speaks, separates, orders, names. No battle is described. No goddess is slain. The world is not made from a divine corpse. Yet the old watery chaos is still under the surface of the language. The deep carries memory of a wider ancient Near Eastern sea of chaos, even if Genesis has tamed it into obedience. Yahweh does not fight the waters like a younger storm warrior struggling to become king. He commands. That difference tells us what the biblical writers want us to feel. Their God does not win order. He speaks it. Still, the question remains, when a text removes the battle, does it erase the older myth? Or does it show that the older myth was known and deliberately overcome? The answer may be both. Ancient writing often argues by rewriting. The same happens with divine council imagery. In older worlds, a high god sits among other gods. In later monotheism, Yahweh stands alone or the other beings are reinterpreted as angels, servants, or powerless idols. The structure remains. The meaning changes. What was once a council of divine powers becomes a court under one sovereign. This is why the Enlil comparison feels tempting. Enlil sends the flood. Yahweh sends the flood. Enlil grants kingship. Yahweh chooses kings. Enlil is command, decree, storm, and authority. Yahweh speaks law from Sinai in thunder, fire, smoke, and trembling earth. Enlil demands order. Yahweh gives ritual law and covenant command. Enlil is feared as the high force of divine administration. Yahweh becomes the God whose word orders Israel, judges nations, and binds kings under covenant. The parallels are not imaginary, but they require caution. Storm authority was not unique to Enlil. Baal, Avad, Teshub, and other storm gods fill the ancient Near Eastern sky. The sound of thunder invited divine imagination everywhere. A desert people who met a god in storm and mountain did not need to borrow everything from Sumer to imagine power in cloud and fire. Also, Yahweh's earliest geography points not to Nippur, but to the south of Canaan, to Seir, Edom, Midian, and Sinai, Tradition. The route is not a straight road from Enlil's temple to Jerusalem's altar. It is a long and shifting web of influence, shared imagery, and theological transformation. So perhaps the better question is not, was Yahweh Enlil? Perhaps it is. Why does Yahweh come to carry so many functions that older gods carried separately? The answer lies in the making of monotheism. One God must do the work of many. He must create like the high creator, storm like the storm god, judge like the divine king, save like the wise helper, destroy like the punisher, heal like the merciful one, receive sacrifice like the temple god, speak law like the cosmic ruler, walk with a people like a tribal patron, rule nations like an imperial sovereign. The God of the Hebrew Bible becomes vast because history forces him to become vast. Local worship, Canaanite high god titles, Southern storm traditions, royal theology, exile, Babylonian myth, prophetic reform, priestly law, and monotheistic insistence all press into one name, Yahweh, a name that begins in mystery and grows heavy with everything it absorbs. That is why the source asks whether Yahweh may be connected to the Anunnaki, and why the careful answer cannot be simple. Direct proof is absent. Yahweh is not named in Sumerian god lists. Enlil is not called Yahweh. The Anunnaki are not secretly listed in the Hebrew Bible under that name. We do not have a tablet that makes the identity clean. But influence does not always leave clean labels. Sometimes it leaves patterns. A divine counsel, a flood, a chosen survivor, a sacred mountain, a storm voice, a god of command, a temple as house, kingship from heaven, humans under divine law, smoke rising after catastrophe. These patterns do not prove that Yahweh was Anunnaki. They show that the biblical imagination grew in soil already thick with older divine worlds. And soil matters. A seed may become its own tree, but the minerals of the ground still move inside it. The fire beside us is quiet now. Imagine two texts lying open under lamplight. On one side, Atrahasis, with Enlil weary of human noise and Enki whispering through reeds. On the other, Genesis, with Yahweh commanding Noah, closing the ark, flooding the world, and receiving sacrifice. Between them is not a straight line, but a dark river of story. We can stand at that river without forcing it to become a road. The old scribes did not write like modern historians. They wrote to confess, defend, preserve, reshape, and worship. They took inherited stories and made them speak their God. That does not make the stories worthless. It makes them layered. Layered like clay. Layered like flood silt. Layered like old temple floors rebuilt after fire and conquest. The question deepens rather than closes. If Yahweh contains judgment like Enlil and mercy like Enki, then the God who emerges from the biblical text is not a simple copy of either. He is a theological furnace where older divine roles are melted together, purified, intensified, and claimed as one. That may be more unsettling than a secret identity. A secret identity can be solved. A transformation cannot. It remains alive, moving through language, faith, memory, and argument. The floodwaters recede. The smoke rises. The names remain suspended in the air. Enlil, Enki, Yahweh, Noah, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim. Different tongues, different temples, different theologies, but one old human fear underneath them all. That the powers above may judge the world. And that survival depends on hearing the warning before the rain begins. The storm image refuses to leave Yahweh, even when later theology lifts him beyond form, beyond weather, beyond body. The oldest poetry still remembers him arriving like a storm over the mountains. The earth trembles. The heavens drip. Clouds gather. Fire moves before him. Thunder becomes voice. The wilderness does not remain scenery. It becomes theater for divine arrival. Yahweh comes from the south. That detail keeps returning. Seir, Edom, Paran, Sinai. Desert places where stone burns under noon and becomes cold under stars. Places of copper dust, Traivadis, thorn scrub, tents, goats, firelight. and sudden storms that make even hard ground smell alive for a little while. The God who later fills heaven and earth first appears in old poetic memory as one who marches from these regions. Now compare Enlil. Enlil is Vint, command, kingship, and the terrible authority of decree. He is not only weather, but weather is never far from him. His word moves like force. His decision can settle fate. His anger can crush cities or send the flood. His favor can place kingship in human hands. He is not a tender household god. He is the power before which households arrange themselves. The resemblance to Yahweh is not exact, but it is strong enough to trouble the imagination. Yahweh thunders at Sinai. Enlil rules from the Ekur, the mountain house. Yahweh gives law. Enlil gives decree. Yahweh chooses kings. Enlil grants kingship. Yahweh sends flood in Genesis. Enlil sends flood in Atrahasis. Yahweh demands ritual order. Enlil stands over cosmic and civic order. It is easy to see why some people ask whether one name hides beneath the other. But again, caution is the candle in this room. Likeness does not equal sameness. Ancient gods shared attributes because ancient peoples shared skies. Thunder was not subtle. Rain decided crops. Wind broke tents, bent trees, cooled skin, carried dust, and brought clouds. A god of storm and command could arise in many places without being borrowed directly from one source. Baal thunders in Canaan. Hadad thunders in Syria. Teshub thunders among the Hurrians and Hittites. Marduk takes storm power in Babylon. Yahweh joins that great storm language, but storm language itself is a common inheritance. Still, Yahweh is not only storm, he becomes high God. That is where El enters again. Elizol, enthroned, fatherly, head of the divine council in Canaanite tradition. His titles, El Elyon, El Shaddai, creator language, father of gods, ancient authority, appear to be absorbed into Yahweh over time. The southern storm god does not remain merely a marching desert power. He fuses with the high God of the settled Canaanite world. Yahweh becomes El. El becomes Yahweh. Or perhaps, in the lived religion of early Israel, the distinction slowly becomes unnecessary. That fusion may explain why biblical Yahweh is both stormy and enthroned, both warrior and creator, both desert marcher and cosmic father, both jealous tribal patron and universal sovereign, a God who absorbs titles, absorbs worlds. Now imagine Abraham leaving Ur, as later tradition remembers it. The scene is not simple history in the modern sense, and scholars debate the historicity of the patriarchal narratives. But as sacred memory, it matters. Ur stands behind him, a city of the moon god Nana, brick, water, trade, temple, and Mesopotamian order. Ahead lie roads, deserts, altars, promises, and a God whose name will become larger through the journey of descendants. The story remembers origins in Mesopotamia. That alone does not prove that Yahweh is Enlil or Anunnaki, but it places Israelite ancestral memory inside the orbit of Mesopotamian civilization. The Bible itself knows that its family story has Eastern roots. Eden lies near rivers named with Mesopotamian geography. Babel lies in Shinar, the land of Sumer. Abraham comes from Ur. Exile goes to Babylon. Return comes from Babylon. The biblical imagination cannot escape Mesopotamia because Mesopotamia stands at both the beginning and crisis points of its memory. Melchizedek also waits in the shadows. He appears briefly, priest of El Elyon, God Most High, King of Salem. Abraham honors him. The scene is short, but it opens an old window. Here is a priest of a high God, not yet named, in the same way later Israel will name Yahweh. And Abraham recognizes the blessing. El Elyon becomes connected with the God Abraham serves. Another merging, another title moving into the growing identity of Yahweh. The Bible is full of such small crossings. Names meeting, titles joining, older divine language being drawn into one covenantal story. Elohim, Adonai, El Shaddai, El Elyon, Yahweh of hosts, Lord of armies, God of gods, King above all gods. These phrases carry older plural worlds, even when later theology insists the plural has no true power. Yahweh does not arrive in history as a blank concept. He arrives clothed in names. Some names from Canaan, some imagery from desert storm, some structures from divine council traditions, some memories shaped under Mesopotamian shadow. This does not diminish the power of the biblical text. In some ways, it explains its power. Yahweh becomes a God capable of absorbing older symbols and making them answer a new theology. He is not merely another storm god because the biblical tradition refuses to leave him there. He becomes the judge of all gods, then the only true God. The path from one to the other is long, and long paths leave footprints. One footprint is the divine council. Another is Yahweh and Asherah. Archaeological inscriptions from sites such as Kuntilet Ajrud and Hirbet El-Kom have been interpreted by many scholars as referring to Yahweh and his Asherah. The phrase is debated in detail. Some argue Asherah refers to the goddess, others to a cult symbol. But either way, the evidence is uncomfortable for a simplified picture of early Israelite monotheism. It suggests that many worshippers linked Yahweh with a female divine figure or sacred object connected to older goddess worship. Picture the inscription emerging from dust. A hand brushes away soil. Letters appear. Not loud, not dramatic, just marks on plaster or stone, carrying a blessing from a world where Yahweh may not yet be alone in the hearts of all who invoked him. The archaeologist does not need thunder. The words are enough. Yahweh and his Asherah. A phrase like a door left open. The prophets, too, preserve the problem. They rage against Baal, against Asherah, against high places, against incense under trees, against altars on hills, against offerings to other gods. If the people had always been strict monotheists, the prophetic anger would make little sense. The anger exists because the practices were real, persistent, lived. People worshipped Yahweh, and also other powers, or worshipped Yahweh in ways later reformers rejected. This is not a minor detail. It means exclusive worship of Yahweh had to be enforced. Hezekiah and Josiah become important here. Their reforms centralize worship, attack high places, remove or suppress rival cult objects, and focus religious legitimacy on Jerusalem. Later biblical history presents these reforms as restoration, the return to proper worship. But historians may ask another question. Were they restoring the original religion, or creating a stricter form from a more plural past? The answer is debated, but the evidence of struggle is clear. Monotheism did not arrive as a smooth sunrise. It came through conflict, through reform, through destruction of shrines, through editing of memory, through insistence that one God alone was to be worshipped. If Yahweh was once part of a wider divine environment, then the history of Israelite religion becomes a story of narrowing and elevation. Narrowing worship to one, elevating that one above all. The old gods do not disappear easily. They become condemned. They become demons. They become angels. They become metaphors. They become nothing. But sometimes their shadows remain in the text. Psalm 82. The sons of God, the heavenly host, the council scenes, the strange plurals, the Nephilim in Genesis 6, where sons of God come to daughters of men and produce mighty ones of old. That passage is brief, almost too brief, as if a door opens and closes before we can step through. Later interpreters have wrestled with it for centuries. Angels, divine beings, human rulers, mythic memory. We cannot be sure, but it again shows that the biblical world remembers more than a flat monotheism. The old divine crowd presses at the edges. This brings us back to Yahweh and Enlil. If Yahweh were simply Enlil, the evidence should be clearer. It is not. If Yahweh had no relationship at all to older Near Eastern divine patterns, the evidence should be quieter. It is not. The truthful place is between those extremes, less exciting than a secret identity, but far more durable. Yahweh is not proven to be Enlil. Yahweh is not proven to be Anunnaki. But the biblical Yahweh emerged in a world shaped by Enlil-like authority, El-like high god imagery, Baal-like storm language, Mesopotamian flood traditions, divine council structures, and political theology where kingship came from heaven. That is already enough to make the history tremble. Imagine two mountains in the dark. One is Nippur, the temple mountain of Enlil in the flatland, built of brick, called Ekur, the mountain house. The other is Sinai, smoking, trembling, wrapped in cloud and fire, where Yahweh gives law. They are not the same mountain. They are not even in the same land. But both are places where divine authority descends, where humans stand below, where command becomes the structure of life. Two names in one wind. Not identical. Not separate enough to ignore. The fire beside us is nearly still, But the question remains awake. The older we go, the less clean the borders become. Desert God, storm gu, high God, council God, temple God, lawgiver, creator, judge, savior, kingmaker. These roles move across cultures like sparks in dry grass. Yahweh becomes the one who gathers them. That gathering is the mystery, not a simply mask over Enlil, not a clean invention from nothing, a layered divine identity forged from desert memory, Canaanite title, Mesopotamian story, Israelite covenant, royal theology, prophetic rage, exile, and reform. The storm rolls over the old lands. Nippur is quiet. Sinai smokes. Jerusalem waits. Babylon watches. And somewhere between them, the name Yahweh grows larger, carrying within it echoes of gods it will one day deny. The old gods do not vanish when a reformer breaks their altar. They sink into the ground. They hide in names, in household charms, in hilltop smoke, in little inscriptions scratched by ordinary hands, in phrases that later scribes would rather smooth away. They remain as shadows under the polished floor of official religion. That is why archaeology can feel so unsettling. It does not argue like a preacher. It simply brushes away dust and shows what people actually touched. Imagine the dry hills of the southern Levant. Stone, wind, olive trees, terraces, small villages holding to the ridges, a shrine on a height where smoke rises in the morning, a family carrying oil, grain, or a small animal, a woman tying a ribbon near a sacred tree, a man speaking the name Yahweh, but not necessarily in the clean way later theology would approve. In lived religion, people rarely move as neatly as books want them to move. The prophets knew this. They shouted against Baal. They shouted against Asherah. They shouted against the high places. They condemned incense under green trees, offerings on hills, local shrines, image, pillars, forbidden altars, and mixed loyalties. Their anger is evidence. A prophet does not spend breath condemning what nobody does. The rage in the text tells us that the plural world remained alive for a long time. This is one of the uncomfortable truths. Ancient Israel was not born as a people of pure and simple monotheism in the way later memory often imagines. Many Israelites worshipped Yahweh, but they may also have recognized other divine powers, used local shrines, honored goddess traditions, or blended older Canaanite practices with Yahweh worship. Some worshipped Yahweh as their chief god, not yet as the only possible god. Some may have seen him as the husband of a goddess. Some carried older ideas inside newer names. The inscriptions are especially quiet and especially sharp. At Kuntilat Adrud and Kirbet El-Kom, ancient writings have been read by many scholars as blessings invoking Yahweh and his Asherah. The phrase is debated. Some say Asherah is the goddess, the great mother figure known from Canaanite tradition. Others say it may refer to a cult symbol, a sacred object, a wooden pole, or the goddess remembered through her symbol. We cannot force certainty where specialists still argue, but either reading is troubling for a simple story, Yahweh and his Asherah. Those words sit like a lamp behind a covered door. Picture the moment of discovery. The brush moves over dust. A surface appears. Letters emerge. Not grand, not jeweled, not carved for kings in monumental stone, but ordinary and stubborn. A blessing from a world where Yahweh could still be spoken with something beside him. The archaeologist pauses, not because the inscription shouts, because it whispers against centuries of later certainty. This is how the past often wounds the present. Not with a sword, with a small phrase. If Yahweh had a goddess partner in some lived Israelite religion, then the official story of exclusive worship becomes the result of struggle. A narrowing, a centralization, a long campaign to remove what many people still practiced. The reforms of Hezekiah and Josiah become central here. They attack high places. They centralize sacrifice in Jerusalem. They remove objects and shrines that the reformers judge illegitimate. The biblical text praises them for restoring true worship. But history asks a quieter question. Were they restoring the original faith, or enforcing a new, stricter form of faith over older local practices? We cannot answer with perfect certainty. The biblical authors themselves frame the reforms theologically, not neutrally. They believe the high places are corruptions. They believe exclusive Yahweh worship is truth. But archaeology and textual traces suggest that ordinary religion was more complex than the final edited story allows. That complexity matters because it shows how a God becomes alone. Not by being alone from the beginning in every home and every hill shrine, but by being made alone through teaching, reform, destruction, memory, law, and story. The divine council passages become even stranger in this light. Psalm 82 has God standing in the assembly of the gods and judging them. Psalm 89 speaks of the council of the holy ones. 1 Kings 22 shows a heavenly court around the throne, with spirits offering counsel. Job begins with the sons of God presenting themselves before Yahweh. Genesis 1 says, "Let us make man in our image," a phrase later theology can explain in different ways, but which still carries the sound of plurality. The old crowd remains, sometimes called gods, sometimes sons of God, sometimes heavenly beings, sometimes hosts. Later interpretation can turn them into angels, and in many traditions, that is exactly what happens. The divine assembly becomes a royal court under one sovereign. The gods are demoted into servants. The many become messengers of the one. The old structure survives, but its meaning changes. That is how theology edits without always erasing. The Nephilim passage in Genesis 6 is one of the most haunting fragments. The sons of God see the daughters of men and take them. And from these unions come the mighty ones of old, men of name. The passage is brief, almost abrupt. It does not explain enough. It opens a door, lets us see a flash of a world where divine and human boundaries blur, then closes again before we can ask too much. Later, readers try to contain it. Angels, human rulers, Sethit descendant, mythic language. There are many interpretations. but the older feeling remains. The Bible preserves a memory of beings from the divine side crossing into human life and producing heroes, giant, or figures of dangerous renown. This resonates with other ancient traditions. Mesopotamia has kings of impossible ages before the flood. Gilgamesh is described as partly divine, a king whose strength and restlessness make him more than ordinary and less than immortal. Greek tradition has demigods born from unions of gods and mortals. Around the ancient world, rulers and heroes often stand at the border between heaven and earth. The border matters. A society that believes kingship descends from heaven may also imagine rulers as touched by divine blood. A society that fears divine beings may tell stories of their forbidden closeness. A society that later wants strict order may preserve older boundary crossings only in fragments, because fragments are easier to survive than full stories. The Tower of Babel carries another kind of boundary fear. The story is set in Shinar, the biblical name linked with the land of Sumer and Babylon. Humans settle there after the flood. They make bricks. That detail matters. Bricks, not stones. Baked or fired materials. Urban technology. They build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. In the old world, this sounds very much like ziggurat imagination, a staged mountain of brick reaching upward, a meeting point between earth and divine realm. Then Yahweh comes down. That phrase is almost ironic. The humans build upward, and the deity descends to inspect it. The fear expressed in the story is not simply height. It is unity. One language, one people, one project. Nothing they propose will be impossible for them. That line is extraordinary. It does not say humans are foolish. It says humans are becoming capable. Then their language is confused. They are scattered. The traditional reading sees pride judged by God. That reading has power. But another layer is possible, and it should be framed carefully as interpretation, not certainty. Babel may preserve an ancient anxiety about human unity, technology, and centralized power. A divine authority sees that humans, if unified, can build toward heaven, and so dispersal becomes control. Bricks in Shinar, a tower to heaven. Adivine descent, a scattering of voices. The story feels like a myth of technological limitation, or at least of cultural fragmentation after human ambition grows too concentrated. If that sounds like the Anunnaki world, the echo is understandable. Sumer gives us cities, ziggurats, divine households, kingship from heaven, bricks, tablets, and human labor organized around sacred authority. Babel turns that world into a warning. A tower rising too high. A humanity too unified. A God who interrupts before the project can continue. Again, not proof that Yahweh is Anunnaki, but proof that the biblical imagination is wrestling with the same ancient materials: brick, tower, heaven, language, power, and divine control. This is where the narrative becomes deeply human, because behind these debates are not only gods and inscriptions, There are people. A woman praying at a hill shrine. A reforming king ordering it destroyed. A scribe preserving a divine council poem while believing in the supremacy of Yahweh. A family saying a blessing that mentions Asherah. A prophet condemning them. A child hearing the Babel story and learning that human unity can threaten heaven. An exile in Babylon looking at ziggurats and wondering why their own temple has fallen. Religious history is not clean because people are not clean. They remember too much. They borrow too easily. They resist reform. They hide beloved practices. They rename old powers. They carry household gods under new laws. They insist their God is one while still dreaming in a world crowded with beings. The official path of Yahweh moves toward exclusivity. The end result is powerful. One God, one Creator, one Judge, one sovereign above all nations. But under that final shape lie many older sediments. El, Baal, Asherah, divine council, sons of God, storm from the south, Mesopotamian float, ziggurat fear, kingship from heaven, temple presence, and the long memory of gods who once stood close to human cities. This does not require cynicism. It requires patience. A faith tradition can be historically layered and still meaningful. A text can preserve older worlds and still speak to later believers. But if we flatten the history too much, we lose the deep drama of how Yahweh became Yahweh, not in heaven, perhaps, but in human memory. Ritual, conflict, exile, and reform. The candle beside us is low now. Imagine the old inscription again. Yahweh and his Asherah. A few words. Dust around them. A world behind them. Nearby. In the mind. Psalm 82 opens. And God judges the gods. Genesis 6. Murmurs of sons of God and mighty ones. Babel rises in brick. A prophet shouts under a hot sky. A reformer breaks a shrine. A village still remembers where it once stood. The past does not vanish. It becomes disputed ground. And as we move toward the final stones, the great ziggurats, pyramids, giant blocks, and ruined platforms that alternative writers love to gather around, we should carry this lesson with us. Mystery is strongest when it does not force every shadow into one answer. Sometimes the shadow is layered. Sometimes the hidden truth is not that one God was secretly another, but that every God humans remember has passed through human hands. Human fear, human politics, human grief, and human longing for the sky to speak back. Stone does not believe in our certainty. It simply remains. That is why the final part of this old question leads away from texts for a while and into the weight of monuments. Clay tablets can be debated line by line. A verse can be translated one way, then another. A name can shift across languages, but a stone block sits in the sun and makes the body feel small before the mind has prepared an answer. The ancient world left many such stones. At Ur, the ziggurat rises from the dust of Mesopotamia like a stairway made for a god who no longer receives bread in the old way. The city is tied in biblical memory to Abraham. Though historians debate how to connect the patriarchal traditions with archaeology, still, the image is powerful. A great brick platform in the land of old gods, dedicated to the moon god Nana, standing under a hard sky, while later faiths remember a family called away from that world. Imagine the excavation. Dust in the mouth, sun on the back of the neck, a brush moving over baked brick, drainage channels, bitumen ceiling, layers of rebuilding, the remains of an urban system sophisticated enough to manage water, lavor, worship, and memory. The ziggurat does not need aliens to become astonishing. It is already astonishing as human organization hardened into architecture. This is the point mainstream archaeology insists on, and it is worth honoring. Ancient people were not fools. They were not children waiting for modern minds to explain stone to them. They could measure, plan, organize labor, move materials, watch stars, engineer drainage, shape bricks, build platforms, preserve rituals, make cities and landscapes that would punish carelessness. To credit them with brilliance is not boring. It is respect. And yet, the stones still trouble people, because some stones are too large for comfort. At Giza, the Great Pyramid stands with such severe geometry that even ordinary description becomes difficult. Limestone blocks stacked into a mountain, granite beams hauled from far away, alignments that still invite study, passage, chambers, shafts, and mass arranged with a precision that makes the modern visitor touch the stone as if the hand might learn the answer through skin. The mainstream explanation involves quarrying, ramps or ramp systems still debated in detail, sledges, water, skilled crews, social organization, royal power, seasonal labor, engineering knowledge, and decades of work. No single cartoon image of slaves dragging stones explains it. The real human explanation is more complex and more impressive. Alternative theorists look at Giza and see lost technology, perhaps inherited from an older civilization, perhaps given by beings remembered as gods. Most such claims outrun the evidence. Still, the feeling that inspires them is understandable. The pyramid is hard to stand beside without suspecting that something has been lost. If not a machine, then a way of organizing time, lavor, belief, and death around one impossible task. Then there is Baalbek. In Lebanon, the great platform holds stones of such enormous size that even photographs do not prepare the body for them. The trilithon blocks sit in the Roman temple complex, placed high in the wall, each weighing hundreds of tons. Nearby quarry stones are larger still, unfinished or abandoned, resting like sleeping beasts. Mainstream archaeology connects the main visible temple to Roman engineering, while also acknowledging older sacred use of the site. Alternative writers gather here quickly. Giants, gods, ancient machines, Anunnaki landing platforms, lost civilizations. The evidence for those claims is weak. But again, the awe is real. A stone so large forces the question of method into the bones. Who moved it? How? Why? What social system makes such effort reasonable? What belief makes it necessary? If you were standing here with me at evening, you might not think first of theories. You might think of silence, the sun lowering behind the mountains, the stone turning gold, then gray, birds crossing above blocks that have outlived empires, your palm on a surface cold despite the day, the uncomfortable feeling that human beings once committed themselves to tasks modern life can barely imagine without engines. The pattern is wide enough to provoke wonder. Not proof of one secret race. Not proof of the Anunnaki behind every stone. Wonder. And wonder should be slower than certainty. This is where the Yahweh question returns. Physical monuments do not prove Yahweh was Anunnaki. The ziggurat at does not prove Abraham met alien gods. The pyramids do not prove lost extraterrestrial engineering. Baalbek does not prove a landing platform. Pumapunku does not prove a vanished machine age. But these monuments do show that ancient people lived inside worlds where divine authority, engineering, kingship, ritual, and cosmic order were fused. A temple platform was not just architecture. It was theology in weight. The Bible emerged from that kind of world. A world of ziggurats, flood myths, divine councils, sacred mountains, temple meals, royal legitimacy, storm gods, high gods, goddess symbols, exile, reforms, and scribes. Yahweh's portrait was formed in argument with that world, sometimes absorbing it, sometimes rejecting it, sometimes turning its own symbols against it. That is why the clean answer fails. Was Yahweh one of the Anunnaki gods? Direct proof says no. The name Yahweh is not found in Sumerian Anunnaki lists. Enlil is not Yahweh in any accepted ancient text. Sitchin's alien framework is not supported by mainstream scholarship. The biblical God cannot be reduced to a simple Mesopotamian mask without doing violence to the distinctive history of Israelite religion. But the opposite answer also fails if it claims total isolation. Yahweh emerged into history within a crowded ancient Near Eastern world. His scriptures preserve divine council scenes, flood parallels, storm imagery, El titles, possible memories of Asherah, heavenly hosts, sons of God, Babel, and theological transformations shaped by Babylonian power. The roots of biblical monotheism are not clean marble. They are layered clay. That may be the real hidden truth. Not alien. Not a single secret tablet. Not one God wearing another God's mask. A slower and stranger process. A regional divine name from the desert rises through history. It merges with high God language. It absorbs storm authority. It battles rival cults. It is proclaimed by prophets. It survives national defeat by becoming larger than the nation. It rewrites flood and creation through one sovereign will. It stands above the council that once surrounded the heavens. It becomes, for later believers, the one God. That transformation is enormous. It deserves awe. It also deserves honesty. The gods withdraw over time. In the oldest stories, Gods valk, speak, eat, fight, appear in fire, wrestle, judge, descend, and gather in councils. Later, the divine voice becomes rarer, more mediated. Scripture, prophete, angel, visio, ritual, inner conviction, silence. The ancient world that once seemed crowded with visible powers becomes, in later religion, a world where God is everywhere and nowhere, present but hidden. Perhaps that is not a loss. Perhaps it is the natural movement of faith into mystery. Or perhaps, as some alternative writers suggest, the gods left, and humans remembered them as theology. That claim remains speculative. It may be poetry, not evidence, but it shows how powerful the old absence feels. We stand among ruins and wonder why the voices stopped. The final archive is quiet. Imagine a table under candlelight. On it lies a clay tablet, broken at one corner. Beside it, an open Bible. Farther away, a small photograph of the ziggurat at Ur. Another of the Sphinx. Another of Baalbek. Another of a desert inscription bearing the name Yahweh. The objects do not agree with one another. They do not form a simple code. They are witnesses from different rooms of the same ancient house. One says, the gods once met in council. One says, Yahweh came from the south. One says, the flood was older than Genesis. One says, a people struggled to worship one God alone. One says, stone can hold ambition longer than language. One says, certainty is often younger than the evidence. No final verdict will be forced tonight. Faith does not need to be mocked. Scholarship does not need to be feared. Mystery does not need to become conspiracy in order to remain powerful. The truth, as far as we can hold it, is layered. Yahweh has a history in human texts and worship. Monotheism developed through time. Ancient Israel was more religiously complex than later memory often admits. Mesopotamian stories shaped the world in which the Bible was written. The Anunnaki were not proven aliens, but they were part of the older divine imagination whose shadows reach far. And ancient people were not primitive fools staring blankly at stones. They were builders, singers, scribes, priests, rebels, mourners, astronomers, farmers, kings, and frightened children under storm skies. They made gods in language, or heard gods in thunder, or both. They lifted stones because death frightened them. They built temples because heaven felt near and far at once. They told flood stories because water remembers how to erase. They kept names because names are small boats across time. The candle is almost gone. The clay tablet is still. The Bible page lies open. Outside, in imagination, desert wind moves across Edom. Storm cloud gathers over Sinai. The old ziggurat of Ur stands beneath stars. The Sphinx watches east. Baalbek stones cool in the night. Puma Punku rests under high, cold air. Nippur sleeps under dust. Jerusalem holds its layered grief. The question remains, but it is softer now. Was Yahweh once one of the Anunnaki gods? The honest answer is that we do not have proof. But we do have echoes. Echoes of divine councils. Echoes of storm gods. Echoes of floods. Echoes of temples where gods were fed. Echoes of older names folded into one name. Echoes of a world where the boundary between myth and history was as thin as smoke. Let the echoes fade slowly. Let Enlil return to Nippur. Let Enki return to the deep waters. Let Asherah stand for a moment beneath her sacred tree, then vanish into dust and debate. Let Yahweh march from the southern mountains, then rise into the mystery later generations called eternal. Let the stones keep what they know. Let the tablets sleep. Let the candle go out. Good night.